My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I'm 78 years old. For nearly 50 years, I've carried a secret that has fundamentally changed how I view humanity, consciousness, and what it means to be civilized. In 1974, when I was a young anthropology graduate student at UC Berkeley, I encountered a couple whose story about their relationship with Bigfoot creatures would shatter every assumption I had about intelligence, empathy, and the true nature of human behavior. What they revealed to me about the differences between our species and theirs wasn't just shocking. It was a mirror that reflected the darkest and most beautiful aspects of human nature. The government has spent decades trying to bury this truth, and the couple I met paid the ultimate price for their honesty. But now, as I face my final years, I know I must share what they taught me before this knowledge dies with me. Before that, I continue. Subscribe to the channel and comment down below where you're watching from. It was the autumn of 1974, and I was 26 years old, working on my master's thesis in cultural anthropology at UC Berkeley. My research focused on folklore and mythology in rural American communities, specifically how isolated populations developed and maintained belief systems that contradicted mainstream scientific understanding. I was particularly interested in cryptozoology, the study of hidden animals, and how these beliefs served social and psychological functions in small communities. My advisor, Dr. Yarki, Robert Chen, had suggested I spend time in the Pacific Northwest, where Bigfoot sightings were becoming increasingly common following the famous Patterson-Gimlin film of 1967. The region was perfect for my research. Isolated logging communities, dense forests that seemed to hold secrets, and a population that maintained strong oral traditions despite the encroaching modern world. I had rented a small cabin near the town of Humboldt, California, in the heart of redwood country. The area was breathtaking, ancient trees that had stood for over 1,000 years, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere where sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts. The air was thick with moisture and the rich scent of decomposing leaves, that earthy perfume that only exists in old-growth forests. My plan was simple: interview local residents about their beliefs and experiences, document the stories that shaped their understanding of the wilderness around them, and analyze how these narratives functioned within their community structure. I expected to find the usual collection of tall tales, misidentifications, and wishful thinking that characterized most cryptozoological claims. I was completely unprepared for what I actually discovered. The couple I met changed everything. Their names were David and Sarah Mitchell, and they lived in a hand-built cabin about 15 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a hiking trail that wound through some of the most remote forest in Northern California. I found them through a chain of referrals that started with a gas station attendant in Humboldt, who mentioned the crazy couple who lives with the monsters. David was 42, a former Vietnam veteran who had come to the Redwoods seeking peace after the war. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors, and eyes that held depths I couldn't immediately understand. Sarah was 38, a former nurse from San Francisco, who had abandoned city life for reasons she was initially reluctant to discuss. Together, they had been living in the wilderness for 8 years, sustaining themselves through hunting, gathering, and a small garden they maintained in a clearing near their cabin. What made them unusual wasn't their lifestyle. Plenty of people had dropped out of mainstream society in the 1960s and 70s, but their claim that they shared their territory with a family of Bigfoot creatures who had become their friends, neighbors, and teachers. I approached them with the skeptical but respectful attitude I had learned to adopt when dealing with believers in the paranormal. My goal was to understand the psychological and social functions their beliefs served, not to challenge or debunk their experiences. I expected to find people who had misinterpreted natural phenomena, who had allowed isolation and wishful thinking to transform ordinary wildlife encounters into something extraordinary. Instead, I found two of the most rational, articulate, and emotionally stable people I had ever met. Our first conversation took place on their cabin porch, with the massive redwoods towering around us like ancient sentinels. David and Sarah spoke about their experiences with a matter-of-fact clarity that was completely at odds with the fantastic nature of their claims. They didn't seem to be seeking attention or validation. In fact, they were initially reluctant to share their story with an outsider. "Most people think we're crazy," Sarah said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had learned to be careful with her words. "We've stopped trying to convince anyone. We just live our lives and let others draw their own conclusions." David nodded, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee made from beans they roasted themselves. "The thing is, Margaret," Can I call you Margaret? What we've learned out here challenges everything most people believe about intelligence, about consciousness, about what it means to be human. It's not comfortable knowledge. Over the next 3 days, they told me their story. David had come to the Redwoods in 1966, shortly after returning from Vietnam. The war had left him with what would now be recognized as PTSD, though the term didn't exist then. He was struggling with nightmares, flashbacks, and a profound sense of disconnection from the civilian world he had returned to. The wilderness offered him something that therapy and medication couldn't: silence, solitude, and the opportunity to rebuild his sense of self, away from the judgment and expectations of society. He had been living alone in a tent for several months when he had his first encounter. "I was gathering firewood about a mile from my camp," he told me, his voice taking on the careful cadence of someone recounting a memory that had been examined countless times. "It was late afternoon, and the light was starting to fade. I heard something moving through the brush, something big. My first thought was bear, so I started making noise, trying to scare it away. Instead of running, the creature had approached. It stepped out from behind a massive redwood, maybe 50 feet away from me. At first I thought it was a person, someone wearing a fur coat or costume. But the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad, arms too long, and the way it moved, there was a grace to it, a deliberateness that was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The creature, a male David estimated, based on its size and build, had stood perfectly still for several minutes, simply observing him. There was no aggression in its posture, no threat, just curiosity. David, drawing on his military training, had remained motionless as well, trying to assess the situation. "The strangest thing was its eyes," David continued. "They were intelligent, not animal intelligence, human intelligence. It was studying me the same way I was studying it, trying to figure out what I was, whether I was dangerous, what my intentions were." The encounter had ended when the creature simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest, with a silence that seemed impossible for something so large. David had returned to his camp shaken, but not frightened, trying to process what he had seen. That first meeting had been the beginning of a relationship that would transform both their lives. Sarah had arrived 2 years later, in 1968, fleeing her own demons. She had been working as a trauma nurse in a San Francisco hospital, dealing with the casualties of the Vietnam War, urban violence, and the social upheaval of the 1960s. The constant exposure to human suffering had left her emotionally exhausted and questioning everything she thought she knew about human nature. "I was losing faith in people," she told me, her voice soft but steady. "Every day I saw what we were capable of doing to each other, the violence, the cruelty, the casual indifference to suffering. I started to believe that maybe we were just a failed species, that consciousness was a mistake evolution would eventually correct." She had met David through a mutual friend in San Francisco, someone who had mentioned the veteran living alone in the Redwoods. Something about his story had resonated with her own need for escape, and she had decided to visit him, initially planning to stay for just a few days. "When I got here and David told me about his encounters with the creatures, I thought he was suffering from some kind of war-related psychosis," she admitted. "But he was so calm, so rational about everything else. And there was something about this place, about the peace he had found here, that made me want to understand what had changed him." Her own first encounter had come 3 weeks after her arrival. She had been alone at the cabin while David was checking his trap lines, reading a book on the porch in the late afternoon sun. A sound had made her look up, not a threatening sound, just something that didn't belong to the usual forest symphony of birds and insects. There was a female standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 yards away, Sarah recalled. She was smaller than the male David had described, but still massive by human standards. 7 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur, with a face that was almost human, but not quite. The female creature had been carrying something, a bundle of plants that Sarah later learned were medicinal herbs. She had approached the cabin slowly, deliberately, stopping about 20 feet from the porch. Then she had done something that changed Sarah's understanding of everything. "She spoke to me," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder even after all these years. Not in words, but in sounds that were clearly communication. A series of low, musical vocalizations that rose and fell like a language. And somehow I understood what she was trying to say. The message had been simple. The female was offering to trade the medicinal plants for some of the vegetables Sarah had been growing in their small garden. It was a business proposition, a gesture of neighborly cooperation between two intelligent species. I was terrified, Sarah admitted, but I was also fascinated. Here was this creature that science said didn't exist, trying to establish a trading relationship with me. I gathered some tomatoes and squash from the garden and placed them on the ground between us. She did the same with her plants. Then we both stepped back and collected what the other had offered. That first trade had been the beginning of a relationship that would evolve over the following years into something unprecedented in human history, a genuine friendship between members of two different intelligent species. Over the next 6 years, David and Sarah had developed an ongoing relationship with what they came to understand was an extended family group of 5 Bigfoot creatures. There was the patriarch, whom they called Elder, the male David had first encountered. His mate, whom they named Gentle, was the female who had initiated trade with Sarah. Their 3 offspring ranged in age from what appeared to be adolescence to young adulthood. The relationship had evolved slowly, built on mutual respect and careful observation. The creatures, David and Sarah had learned to think of them as people, not animals, had their own complex social structure, their own language, their own culture. They were vegetarians by choice, not biology, having developed sophisticated knowledge of plant nutrition and medicine. They had art, music, and what could only be described as philosophy. But most remarkably, they had developed insights into human nature that were both profound and disturbing. They had been watching humans for decades, David explained. Not just us, but logging crews, hikers, hunters, researchers. They had observed our behavior, our social structures, our treatment of each other and the environment, and they had reached conclusions about our species that were uncomfortable. The creatures had shared these observations with David and Sarah through a combination of their own language, which the couple had slowly learned to understand, and a form of pictographic communication using symbols drawn in dirt or arranged with stones and sticks. What they revealed about human behavior was a mirror that reflected both the worst and best aspects of our species. They couldn't understand human violence, Sarah told me, her voice heavy with the weight of years of difficult conversations. Not just war, but the casual cruelty we show to each other and to other species. They had watched logging crews destroy 1,000-year-old trees for profit, had seen hunters kill animals for sport rather than food, had observed humans polluting streams and leaving trash in pristine wilderness. But what puzzled them most wasn't the environmental destruction. They understood that humans, like any species, needed resources to survive. What they couldn't comprehend was the apparent pleasure some humans took in causing unnecessary suffering. Elder once showed us a series of symbols that represented his observations of human hunting practices, David recalled. He could understand killing for food. That was natural, necessary. But he had watched hunters wound animals and then track them for hours, prolonging their suffering. He had seen people kill predators not because they posed a threat, but simply because they were predators. The concept of killing for entertainment was completely alien to their way of thinking. The creatures had developed a complex taxonomy of human behavior based on their observations. They recognized that humans existed on a spectrum of consciousness and empathy, from those who seemed to actively enjoy causing suffering to those who went out of their way to prevent it. They had words in their language for different types of humans, Sarah explained. There were the pain makers, humans who seemed to derive pleasure from causing suffering. The blind walkers, those who caused harm through ignorance or indifference rather than malice. The life protectors, humans who actively worked to prevent suffering and preserve life, and a few others that were harder to translate. But their observations weren't entirely negative. The creatures had also witnessed acts of human compassion, creativity, and self-sacrifice that impressed them deeply. They had watched rescue workers risk their lives to save strangers, had observed artists creating beauty for its own sake, had seen parents sacrifice everything for their children's welfare. What fascinated them most about humans was our capacity for change, David said. They had observed individuals transform from one category to another, painmakers who became life protectors, blind walkers who developed awareness and empathy. This kind of fundamental personality change was rare in their own species. The creatures themselves represented something that human civilization had largely lost, a society based on consensus rather than hierarchy, on cooperation rather than competition, on sustainability rather than growth. They had achieved what human philosophers had theorized about for centuries, a truly egalitarian society where individual needs were balanced against collective welfare. They made decisions through a process that could take days, Sarah explained. Everyone in the group had a voice, including the youngest. They would discuss issues from every possible angle, considering not just immediate consequences, but effects that might not be felt for generations. It was democracy in its purest form. Their economic system, if it could be called that, was based on gift exchange and mutual aid rather than accumulation and competition. Resources were shared according to need, and the concept of individual ownership was limited to personal items like tools or decorative objects. They couldn't understand human hoarding behavior, David noted. The idea that someone would accumulate more resources than they could possibly use while others went without was incomprehensible to them. It violated their basic understanding of social cooperation. But perhaps most remarkably, they had developed a form of conflict resolution that eliminated violence entirely. Disputes were settled through a combination of discussion, mediation by neutral parties, and, if necessary, temporary separation until emotions cooled and rational thought could prevail. In 6 years of close observation, we never saw them engage in physical violence against each other, Sarah said. Not once. They had disagreements, certainly, and sometimes heated arguments, but they had cultural mechanisms for preventing those disagreements from escalating to violence. This wasn't because they were incapable of violence. Their physical strength was enormous, and they were certainly capable of defending themselves when threatened. But they had made a collective choice to resolve conflicts through communication rather than force. Elder once explained to us that violence was a choice, not an instinct, David recalled. He said that any intelligent species could choose cooperation over conflict, but that it required constant effort and cultural reinforcement. Humans, he believed, had the capacity for the same choice, but had developed cultural systems that encouraged competition and aggression instead. The creature's observations of human behavior had led them to some profound insights about the nature of consciousness and intelligence. They believed that awareness existed on a spectrum, and that many of the problems plaguing human society stemmed from individuals operating at lower levels of consciousness, while holding positions of power and influence. They had a concept that roughly translates to sleeping intelligence, Sarah explained. The idea that someone could be technically intelligent, capable of complex reasoning and problem-solving, while remaining unconscious of the broader implications of their actions. They saw this as the root cause of much human suffering. According to their observations, humans operating at higher levels of consciousness naturally developed empathy, environmental awareness, and a sense of responsibility for the welfare of others. Those operating at lower levels remained focused on immediate personal gratification, regardless of the consequences for others. They believed that human civilization was at a critical point, David said, that our species had developed technology that amplified our capacity for both creation and destruction, but hadn't developed the wisdom to use that technology responsibly. They saw this as an evolutionary test. Either we would learn to operate at higher levels of consciousness, or we would destroy ourselves and take much of the planet's ecosystem with us. But they also believed that humans had unique gifts that their own species lacked. Our creativity, our adaptability, our capacity for rapid innovation, all of these were seen as valuable contributions to the larger community of intelligent life on Earth. They didn't see themselves as superior to humans, Sarah clarified, just different. They had achieved stability and sustainability, but at the cost of dynamism and growth. Humans had achieved incredible technological advancement and artistic expression, but at the cost of environmental destruction and social conflict. They believed that both species could learn from each other. This belief had motivated their decision to make contact with David and Sarah. They saw the couple as representatives of the best aspects of human consciousness, individuals who had chosen cooperation over competition, sustainability over growth, peace over conflict. They hoped that by sharing their knowledge and observations, they could help humanity navigate the challenges that threatened both species' survival. The knowledge they shared was both practical and philosophical. They taught David and Sarah sustainable living techniques that had been refined over thousands of years, methods of forest management that increased biodiversity while providing for human needs, plant medicines that could treat ailments without harmful side effects, construction techniques that created comfortable dwellings without damaging the surrounding ecosystem. But more importantly, they shared their perspectives on consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of civilized behavior. They challenged fundamental assumptions about progress, success, and the relationship between individual and collective welfare. They made us question everything we thought we knew about human nature, David said. We had been raised to believe that competition and aggression were natural, inevitable aspects of human behavior. But they showed us examples of human societies that had chosen different paths. indigenous cultures that had achieved sustainability and social harmony through cooperation rather than conflict. The creatures had studied human history through careful observation of archaeological sites and oral traditions passed down through contact with various indigenous peoples. They had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the patterns of growth, conflict, and collapse that seem to characterize human social development. They saw our current global civilization as following the same pattern that had destroyed previous human societies, Sarah explained. Rapid growth, resource depletion, social inequality, environmental degradation, and ultimately collapse. But they also believed that we had reached a level of awareness where we could choose a different path if enough individuals operated at higher levels of consciousness. Their message to humanity, transmitted through David and Sarah, was both a warning and an offer of hope. The warning was that our current trajectory was unsustainable and would lead to civilizational collapse within decades if unchanged. The hope was that we possessed the intelligence and creativity necessary to develop new forms of social organization that could provide for human needs while maintaining ecological balance. But they also made it clear that this transformation would require fundamental changes in human consciousness and values. It wasn't enough to develop new technologies or political systems. We needed to evolve psychologically and spiritually to match our technological capabilities. They believed that the next stage of human evolution would be psychological rather than physical, David said. That we would need to develop higher levels of empathy, awareness, and wisdom to survive as a species. They saw this as both possible and necessary, but not inevitable. The relationship between David, Sarah, and the creature family continued to deepen over the years. They learned to communicate more effectively, developed genuine friendships with individual family members, and began to see themselves as ambassadors between species rather than simply observers of an unusual phenomenon. But this relationship also came with risks that would ultimately prove fatal. In 1973, a year before I met them, their secret had been discovered by federal agents who had been investigating reports of Bigfoot sightings in the area. The agents had been conducting surveillance of the region using new satellite technology and had detected anomalous heat signatures and movement patterns that suggested the presence of large, intelligent creatures. They approached us one morning while we were working in the garden, Sarah recalled, her voice tightening with the memory. 3 men in dark suits, completely out of place in the wilderness. They knew about our relationship with the creatures, had photographs of us interacting with them, had been watching us for months. The agents had made an offer that was really a threat. David and Sarah could cooperate with a government research program designed to study and potentially capture the creatures, or they could face charges related to harboring endangered species, interfering with federal investigations, and violations of various environmental protection laws. They wanted us to betray our friends, David said, his voice filled with quiet anger, to lead them to the family's territory, to help them set traps, to participate in their capture and imprisonment. They talked about the creatures like they were specimens to be studied, rather than people with rights and feelings. David and Sarah had refused, despite the legal threats and the promise of financial compensation. They had warned the creature family about the government interest, and together they had developed plans for avoiding detection and protecting the family's territory. But the pressure had been enormous. The agents had returned repeatedly, escalating their threats and increasing their surveillance of the area. They had brought in additional personnel, sophisticated tracking equipment, and what appeared to be military specialists trained in capture operations. We knew it was only a matter of time before they found the family, Sarah said. The creatures were incredibly skilled at avoiding detection, but the government had resources and technology that made hiding increasingly difficult. We were all living under constant stress, constantly looking over our shoulders. The situation had reached a crisis point in the summer of 1974, just months before I met them. The creature family had made a decision that broke David and Sarah's hearts. They were leaving the area, migrating to more remote territory in Canada, where they hoped to avoid government attention. The goodbye was the hardest thing we've ever experienced, Sarah said, tears forming in her eyes even after all these years. These beings had become our family, our teachers, our closest friends. We had learned more from them about what it means to be truly human than we had learned in all our previous years of life. And now they were leaving, possibly forever, because our own species couldn't accept their existence. The final meeting had taken place in the same clearing where David had first encountered Elder 8 years earlier. The entire creature family had gathered to say farewell, sharing gifts and expressing their gratitude for the friendship and protection David and Sarah had provided. Elder gave us a message to share with other humans if we ever found someone we trusted, David said. He wanted us to tell your species that consciousness is a gift that comes with responsibility, that intelligence without wisdom leads to destruction, that the choice between cooperation and conflict will determine the future of all life on Earth. The creatures had also shared a prophecy of sorts, a prediction based on their observations of human behavior and historical patterns. They believed that humanity was approaching a critical decision point where we would either evolve to a higher level of consciousness or face civilizational collapse within the next 50 years. They said that the signs would be obvious to those who knew how to read them, Sarah explained. Environmental degradation, social inequality, the rise of authoritarian leaders who appealed to humanity's lowest instincts rather than our highest aspirations. But they also said that there would be counter-movements, groups of humans working to develop higher consciousness and more sustainable ways of living. The creatures had left specific instructions for recognizing and supporting these positive developments. They had identified certain practices, values, and social structures that indicated movement toward higher consciousness, and they had encouraged David and Sarah to share this knowledge with others who might be ready to receive it. They believed that the transformation of human consciousness would happen through individuals rather than institutions, David said. That people like you, Margaret, who were willing to question assumptions and seek truth regardless of how uncomfortable it might be, would be the catalyst for positive change. After the creature's departure, David and Sarah had remained in their cabin, maintaining their sustainable lifestyle and waiting for opportunities to share the knowledge they had gained. They had become more cautious about who they trusted with their story, knowing that government agents were still monitoring the area and that their own safety depended on discretion. "We've been waiting for someone like you," Sarah told me on my final day with them. "Someone with the academic credentials to be taken seriously, but also the open mind necessary to accept what we're telling you. We hope you'll find a way to share this knowledge with others who are ready to hear it." They had given me detailed notes about their observations, copies of the pictographic communications they had received from the creatures, and specific instructions about sustainable living practices that could be adapted for broader use. But more importantly, they had given me a new understanding of what it means to be human and what our species could become if we chose to evolve consciously, rather than simply react to circumstances. I left their cabin with my worldview fundamentally altered. The couple I had expected to study as examples of folklore and mythology had instead become my teachers, sharing knowledge that challenged every assumption I had about intelligence, consciousness, and human potential. But I also left with a growing sense of urgency. The creatures' warnings about humanity's trajectory seemed increasingly relevant as I observed the social and environmental changes taking place in the 1970s. The oil crisis, the Watergate scandal, the growing awareness of environmental degradation. All of these seemed to confirm the patterns the creatures had identified. I returned to Berkeley and completed my thesis, but I found it impossible to write about David and Sarah's experiences in an academic context. The knowledge they had shared was too sensitive, too potentially dangerous, to be published in scholarly journals where it might attract government attention. Instead, I focused my research on indigenous wisdom traditions and sustainable living practices, hoping to find ways to share the creatures' insights without revealing their source. Over the following years, I maintained contact with David and Sarah through carefully coded letters and occasional visits. They continued to live in their remote cabin, practicing the sustainable lifestyle the creatures had taught them, and waiting for opportunities to share their knowledge with others. But the government surveillance never ended. In 1978, 4 years after I met them, David and Sarah were found dead in their cabin. The official cause of death was listed as carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty wood stove, but the circumstances were suspicious. Neighbors reported seeing unmarked vehicles in the area shortly before the deaths, and the couple's extensive notes and documentation about their experiences with the creatures had disappeared. I learned about their deaths through a brief newspaper article that described them as reclusive survivalists who had died in a tragic accident. There was no mention of their real identities, their backgrounds, or the knowledge they had possessed. They had been erased from history as efficiently as if they had never existed, but their message lived on in the people they had touched. I spent the next 46 years carefully sharing the insights they had given me, always being cautious about revealing the source of my knowledge. I became involved in environmental organizations, indigenous rights groups, and consciousness research communities, looking for ways to promote the values and practices the creatures had identified as crucial for human survival. I watched as many of their predictions came true, Environmental degradation accelerated, social inequality increased, and authoritarian movements gained power around the world. But I also witnessed the emergence of the counter-movements they had foreseen, groups of people working to develop sustainable technologies, more equitable social systems, and higher levels of consciousness. The knowledge David and Sarah shared with me influenced everything I did for the rest of my career. I became a professor of anthropology, specializing in indigenous wisdom traditions and sustainable living practices. I wrote books about consciousness and social evolution, always careful to present the creature's insights as products of my own research rather than revelations from another species. But I never forgot the source of my understanding, and I never stopped hoping that someday it might be safe to tell the full truth. That day has finally come. I am 78 years old now, and I can feel the weight of my years. The knowledge that David and Sarah entrusted to me has shaped my entire adult life, but it was never meant to die with me. The creature's message to humanity is more relevant now than ever, as we face environmental collapse, social fragmentation, and the rise of authoritarianism around the world. The beings that David and Sarah knew understood something that our species is still struggling to learn, that consciousness is a choice, that intelligence without wisdom leads to destruction, that the future belongs to those who choose cooperation over conflict. They saw humanity as a species in transition, capable of either transcendence or self-destruction depending on the choices we make in the coming decades. They believed that individuals operating at higher levels of consciousness could serve as catalysts for positive change, helping our species evolve beyond the patterns of competition and aggression that have characterized much of our history. But they also understood that this transformation wouldn't happen automatically. It would require conscious effort, deliberate choice, and the courage to question fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. The practices they taught David and Sarah, sustainable living, consensus decision-making, conflict resolution through communication rather than force, weren't just survival techniques. They were technologies of consciousness, methods for developing the wisdom necessary to match our technological capabilities. Their observations about human behavior weren't meant as criticism, but as guidance. They had identified the patterns that lead to suffering and destruction, but they had also recognized the patterns that lead to flourishing and growth. They believed that humans could choose which patterns to reinforce and which to abandon. The message they wanted me to share is both simple and profound. We are not prisoners of our biology or our history. We have the capacity to evolve consciously, to choose cooperation over competition, to develop wisdom to match our intelligence, to create social systems that serve life rather than destroy it. But this evolution won't happen through technology or political reform alone. It requires a fundamental shift in consciousness, a recognition that our individual welfare is inseparable from the welfare of all life on Earth. The creatures that David and Sarah knew had achieved this recognition thousands of years ago. They had created a society based on wisdom rather than cleverness, on sustainability rather than growth, on cooperation rather than domination. They offered their knowledge not as a blueprint to be copied exactly, but as proof that alternatives to our current trajectory are possible. Whether we choose to learn from their example or continue down the path toward civilizational collapse is up to us. The creatures believed that humans possess unique gifts, creativity, adaptability, innovation, that could be used to develop solutions they themselves couldn't imagine. But they also understood that these gifts could be used for destruction as easily as creation. The choice is ours, and the time for choosing is running out. I've spent nearly 50 years carrying this knowledge, waiting for the right moment to share it fully. That moment is now. The environmental crisis, the social upheaval, the growing awareness that our current systems are unsustainable. All of these create an opening for the kind of consciousness shift the creatures believed was necessary for human survival. David and Sarah paid with their lives for their friendship with beings who represented humanity's potential for wisdom and compassion. Their sacrifice shouldn't be meaningless. The knowledge they preserved, the insights they shared, the example they set, all of this should serve as inspiration for those ready to choose a different path. The creatures are still out there, somewhere in the remote wilderness areas that remain. They're watching, waiting, hoping that our species will prove capable of the wisdom they knew we possessed. They're not our saviors. They made it clear that each species must find its own path to survival. But they're our teachers, our examples, our proof that consciousness can choose cooperation over conflict. The question is whether we're ready to learn. If you made it this far, leave a comment and subscribe. It helps stories like this continue to be told.